Hi there, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around manifesting a new world. I am your host, Florence Adu, and I am coming to you live from across same bat station, same bat place kind of sort of thing lately. And I'm really excited about my guest because she's the first of my guests that I am interviewing from what was a writers festival called Peja. That is a festival that takes place in October here in Ghana. And I've seen it grow over the years. And I'm just so encouraged by just the fact that they are doing the work to bring writing and literary commentary and concepts to the fore for Africa. You know, it's very Pan-African, which I loved about it. And so that's where I met my guest. And so let me just get to her introduction. She is an award-winning nonfiction writer. She's a teacher and an avid traveler. She is currently a graduate student at the University of East Anglia School of Literature, Drama, and Creative Writing, studying biography and creative nonfiction. She's won the Literary Award for Narrative Nonfiction of the Tucson Festival of Books, the Stephen J. Meringoff Award for Nonfiction at the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, and the Archie D. and Bertha H. Walker Scholarship for Writers of Color from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. In 2015, she was nominated for the Pushcart Prize by the Oracle Fine Arts Review, and in 2020, she was longlisted for the inaugural Toyin Falola Prize for Emerging African Writers and was published in the prize's anthology, In the Sands of Time in 2022. In addition to being a 2019 resident at the 7th Waves Rhinebeck Residency, she is a Voices of Our Nations Workshop Fellow, a Tin House Summer Workshop alumni, and has presented at several Association of Writing and Writing Programs conferences. A contributing editor for nonfiction at Electric Literature, she is also currently published at Al Jazeera, The Globe and Mail, Catapult, The Broad Street Review, Business Insider, and Africa is a Country, among others. Michelle Alipao Chikaonda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited for this conversation.
Yay! So let's get started. Where are you from? Where are you local? And what is your craft?
All right, where am I from? That is always, for folks like us, a multifaceted answer. I'm from Malawi. That is where both sides of my family are, mother and father side. In Malawi, you might say that's also where my graveyard is, because your life is often, it's also defined, like where you're from is like, oh, that's where our people are buried, because you go back to where your people are. And that's where I go home regularly for holidays and everything. I was born in the US while my parents were in school. My dad got a USAID scholarship to do graduate school in the US, and me and my siblings were born there. We then moved to Canada shortly after that when my dad couldn't get papers to stay and work in the US. You know how the US often is about giving about papers and residency and whatnot. So we moved to Newfoundland, Canada, where he was a professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and we lived there for 6 years until Malawi got democracy after 30 years of autocracy, and we moved back to Malawi about 2 months after we formally were a democratic nation. So I've lived in a lot of places. Where I am local now is the United Kingdom. As you said earlier in my introduction, I am a graduate student, a master's degree student right now at the University of East Anglia, where I'm studying biography and creative nonfiction. I decided to come here. I'd been in the US for 20 years, and I sort of realized a lot of the events of 2020 really made me think a lot about what it is to be Black in America. And I realized that I needed to leave the US in order to be able to reflect on that and do that thinking and writing accurately. I also, my father passed away 4 years ago, and, Malawi is geographically closer to the UK than it is to the US. And so with thinking about, hey, I want to spend more time writing, and where's a good place to be closer to mom in Malawi without necessarily being in Malawi, which carries its own challenges, I decided on the UK, which is sort of a really interesting choice for many reasons, chief among which is that, of course, the UK was actually the country, I wouldn't say global power is a strong word, but country that colonized us. And so it is very interesting to have arrived here. I landed here 2 days before Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. When my
Oh,
parents were born, technically they were, or at least per what the
subjects.
rule, they were subjects. Yes, they were subjects at that time. My grandma was born a year before Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was born 1926. My grandma was born 1925. Grandma is still around, still very
Mm.
sharply opinioned.
Yeah.
And, it's really interesting to think about all these geopolitical dynamics and, that have meant me being in this very specific space and time right now.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's really long. Yes, very, very long answer. But to answer the third part, I'm a writer. That is my profession. And so, so I have a lot of words for a lot of the things I think about.
Uh-huh,
Yeah.
uh-huh, nice. So let me go back to your cultural origins. And so where in Malawi are you from?
Excellent question. So my father is from Dedza, which is in the central region. And my mother is from Zomba, which is in the southern region. They met when they were at the Polytechnic, one of the branches of the University of Malawi, which is itself in the southern region. The Polytechnic is in Blantyre. It's actually just a very short drive from where my mother still lives now.
Mhm.
Where you are from, it's, people will give depending on who you ask, they will say where you're from is your father's village or where you're from is your mother's village. On my national ID card, it says my mother's village, and so it says that I'm from Zomba. But when you meet people on a day-to-day basis and, ask where you're from, and I'll be like, oh, actually, both Dedza and Zomba, me too many years in the US trying to be
Mm.
equivocal about both, they'll say, no, you're from your father's village, so you're from Dedza.
Oh.
And so, it varies, on my previous passports, it has said my traditional authority, which they will list, in U.S. passports, they will say issuing authority, which is, the U.S. State Department, or or the particular office that is, that the passport was made in. In Malawi passports, it used to say your traditional authority, and so that would be the chief of chiefs of your area. And so that was back in those days, that was my dad's area. So it would be Chief Kachindamoto, who is still the traditional authority now.
Mm.
That's a very complicated question. I consider myself to be from both,
Mhm.
and identification documents aside, I spend equivocal time in both places when I go home, obviously mainly staying with my mother, but make sure to go to my dad's village. That's where he's buried. Go to my mom's village. Obviously, that's where, my grandmother lives with my mother now, but, everyone else, my cousins and everybody, they're all still there. So, go see them there.
Wow. So is it matrilineal or patrilineal there in terms of like inheritance rights, or is it tribal by tribe that it changes?
By tribe, it changes, yes.
Okay.
So in the north, they have the Lobola system that you'll see in a lot of southern Africa, where the man's side of the family will pay a bride price,
Mhm.
and then the children will it basically, if anything happens in case of a
They
split up
belong.
or a parental death or anything like that, the children will go to the man's side. If they don't complete paying Lobola, then it'll go to the mother's side.
Mm.
In the middle of, central region, southern region, it is generally matrilineal.
Mm. Okay.
Now there are certain tribes, ethnic groups within that, where there might be a symbolic, price paid in heads of cattle. You know, um, if people choose to, but more as a recognition of tradition more than anything else.
Sure.
But it might signal more that, okay, although generally we are matrilineal, the man has agreed to pay these, and that means that, if anything happens, we're leaning more on the man's side to define what happens next after a loss or in case of decision making and whatnot. So it varies very much, of course, also in part because, when the various European powers arrived, they defined the borders themselves based on their own resource needs and not
Mhm.
on what is actually going on the ground in terms of where these ethnic groups are actually located.
Mhm.
So my dad's group are the Ngonis, which are an offshoot of the Zulus.
Mm. Mhm.
Shaka Zulu had an argument with his brother in the mid 1820s. I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but it's basically the Mfekane or the Mfekane, something like that. And basically there was a split, and he basically said, okay, you guys need to take your people and get out. I'm tired of you. And so Shaka Zulu's brother took his
Uh-huh.
people and started migrating up north. And so they settled in various parts of South Africa. Like, they settled in Swaziland, they settled in parts of Zimbabwe. And so those languages that you'll find in those places, in Swazi and in like in Ndebele and Chiangoni, which you'll find parts of Malawi they speak, these are all mutually intelligible because these are all basically people of the same nation who migrated upwards, settled here, settled here, settled here. So Ngoni land is actually what I might call Ngoni land, actually sits partially between Malawi and Zambia, alongside our northern borders. And so there are various festivals over the course of the year for which if you're crossing into Zambia or if Zambians are crossing into Malawi to attend things, you don't actually need a passport, or you don't need a paper passport. You just need to be wearing your tribal gear and whatnot, and then you'll go past the border. Because of course, these papers were really inventions of the white people.
Right.
And so, and how are you gonna ask a villager, to say, oh, can you pay whatever, tens of thousands of kwacha for this little passport book that you will only use once every so often, and that is meant to signify, citizenship in a place that sort of is
your own.
Yeah, it's your own. It's already your own. Exactly. So.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So, that conversation about the borders is a huge conversation. And so, I'm not super familiar with Southern Africa, but I definitely know, particularly here in West Africa, it's like, why Togo and Benin? Why all of that? Because we're all the same. Like, we speak the same language. We just have a border because the French said, oh, we're going to take this much. And then you take that. And it's kind of very ridiculous. Yeah.
I learned so much actually from some of the other attendees at Peja. Mm-hmm. I think when you are mostly just in your region, you think these issues are just yours. Mm-hmm. And then so to talk to other people, other folks I was on panels with about the various issues that they are writing about, like related to like tribes and ethnicity and these conflicts that are crossing these borders, quote unquote borders that, say the French left or the British left, but because those lands that are being contested that have nothing to do with those borders that were drawn, it was really both fascinating and sort of a light going on to say, oh yes, like this is a cross-continental reality. Like we are all struggling with this sort of like post-colonial reality,
Right. Interesting. Okay. So, and so you basically are a dual citizen.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So I always ask this question of the creatives of African parents because it's always a big question. So your craft is being a writer, and most parents would have said, oh no, you're not a writer, you're a professor or you're something of another sort. Yes. So tell us like what your inspiration is and the background that allows you to call yourself a writer.
You mean like what I was supposed to be first? Yeah. So I came home at the end of freshman year because I went to university in the U.S. Having U.S. Papers meant that was a decision that was easier.
Yes.
And I came home at the end of freshman year, and I'd had a piece published in the school newspaper a couple of months before, actually just a month before, about an unfortunate incident where it had a racial slur yelled at me on the way home from a spring fling party. And that essay had done really well. It was an op-ed piece, and I was in a writing class at the time already, and my writing professor was super supportive. And so I went home and told my father. I said, I think I want to be a writer. I think I'm going to major in English. And he was like, you already speak English. And I was like, right. I'm talking about literature. It's not just. And he said, so you're going to go all the way to the U.S. and you're going to come back after all these 4 years of studying, and you're going to tell people in Malawi that you studied English. That is not acceptable. This is not happening.
Right.
And so, I eventually compromised with them to do international relations.
Okay.
And why that happened, it was, that first summer home in Malawi, there was, not a whole lot to do. So I was reading a lot. My dad was a really avid reader, and he, had shelves and shelves of books. And so I started reading books specifically about, it was international relations, but a lot specifically about like Africa and Africa in relationship to the West. And I ended up choosing international relations. I said, I kind of want to understand more about why our borders look the way they do, but I won't understand enough if I just do African studies. I didn't feel that way at the time. In retrospect, I probably would have. We had a very good African studies department at my university. But yeah, so I decided on international relations with a minor in creative writing.
Okay.
And that was the compromise.
Okay.
I had wanted to do, or not wanted to, it had always been impressed on me that I would become a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
In high school in Malawi, I was very good at math, biology, chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
I did my last 2 years of school at a small international school in Wales called United World College of the Atlantic. And the United World Colleges are a school group. There's now 20 of them. Back in my day, there were 10 of them, but they were a school group that was basically founded with the intention of sort of really pushing this idea of like the global citizen,
Mm-hmm.
and to say, have each of these schools never have a critical mass of any one nationality, even the nationality that the school is situated in. The idea is that when you have these small numbers of everyone, you all just sort of have to figure out actually how to really talk to each other, how to communicate. And because you're so young, it's very emotional rather than like logical, which means that when you meet again in 20, 30 years, you're at boardrooms and discussion tables and podcasts and everything. Someone can say something, when people say something that's like dismissive or making these prejudgments, you've had this experience growing up with people when you were kids, together, and say, no, you're wrong about that. And it's deeply instinctive. And so I went to that school.
How did you happen on that school? So you were in high school in Malawi, and then
I was in high school in Malawi, and my dad, someone had connected him with this. He'd gone to some event, I believe, because I remember an event related to this school, related to United World Colleges. Because I remember him coming home with a pamphlet book about it. He may have also just given it to me. I don't know. In my head, I'm like, oh, I went to their bedroom and took it. He may have just been like, this is something for you to think about in 4 years. Because I do remember I was 12 when I first saw the pamphlet.
Okay.
I started at school when I was 16.
Oh, okay.
So it was a long run up time.
Okay.
And so as I was going through my GCSEs and whatnot, that's what we were doing at this school, GCSEs, IGCSEs. I realized that if I stayed at that school, I was going to have to do A-levels, and A-levels is only 3 subjects. And I really wasn't sure if I wanted to focus down that quickly. I also knew that I would be tracked into math, biology, chemistry. And I think that was actually the beginnings of me being like, do I really know that I want to be a doctor? I don't know. And so this particular school had the International Baccalaureate, which is 6 subjects, 3 higher levels that are basically the same as A-levels, and 3 standard levels for which you spend half that study time, as well as a service component, a creativity component, and an activity component. And they sort of basically push, the idea that by the time you graduate, there should be lots of things that comprise who you are as a learner and person.
Yep.
I truly think it's a life-changing experience, and I will, gladly proselytize to anybody about it. Because I think it's just so great for young people to go through that. Most of the schools are fully scholarship supported because they want to be sure that everyone has the opportunity to attend regardless of funding. And they do actually really good work with their fundraising and everything because, of course, it's a really good mission in a very complicated world as ours is now. But yeah, so I went to that school, and then I did less well in math and science.
Okay.
And I think that was the beginning of me realizing that I wasn't particularly interested in the math and science track. So once at university, I really didn't do well in my chemistry class in particular. And that was the end of me pretending that I was going to be able to simply like slide on up to medical school.
Right.
So I did international relations and minored in creative writing. And then I graduated and moved to New York City because I think that's where I thought I had to live to be a writer.
Okay.
It's like, oh, be a starving writer in New York. And I was just, 24 years old in New York, right? like working a lot, not making a whole lot of money, going out way too much, and not doing a whole lot of writing. It was only about the year I turned 25 when, around that mid-20s time when everybody starts thinking about what is my direction actually going to be? Like people start thinking about graduate school. That's when the first in our peer set began to get engaged, other folks began to pair up in serious ways. Like I can see now in retrospect, people started relationships in that period of time that are now the people that they are, married and have children with. And so it was this time when everybody was beginning to shift their lives into the next gear. And I realized that if I was going to take writing seriously, I needed to live in a city that was cheaper than New York City, and that didn't have as many distractions, so I could actually focus on writing. And so I actually moved back to Philadelphia. That is where I did my undergraduate years. I also had it in mind, which I then did do, but I wanted to work at a university because they really are great environments for supporting the work, like writing work, access to libraries, free classes, journal access, which is huge, being able to do any research you need to without, needing to be like to pay for it or be authenticated by anything. And so I ended up then working back at my undergraduate institution, and I was there for 10 years. I mean, that is where, until I left 2 months ago to then move
Oh, wow.
to school. Yeah, just graduate school here in the UK. Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. So you were there for 10 years. So there was something that kept you involved and interested in that work,
Yeah.
what you were doing. So tell us about what that work was like and being back.
It's interesting. Like how it's talking about about age, mid-20s is when people's life directions began to sort of meaningfully shift. I think it's also when life started to happen, full stop. I remember like the year that I started at Penn, again, as an employee now in 2012, that is when some of my closest friends had their first babies. That is when some other friends had lost parents. That was the beginning that was almost like phase one of the age of parent loss, where it is like heart attacks and cancers and stuff. And that was all around that time. I worked in the admissions office for 3 years, and not on the reading side, but in the application support side. So like talking to parents and talking to students and, writing, thoughtfully composed emails to disappointed constituents, we would say, but parents, students, counselors, etc.
Yeah.
Being a part of the welcome events, like on-campus welcome events and whatnot. I did that for 3 years. And then I moved over to I worked at the University of Pennsylvania. So I worked at the Penn Alumni Interview Program, and I was there for 7 years. And that was not my intention. And I actually told them this at my goodbye party. They threw a wonderful goodbye party for me with like British flags and everything everywhere and like British beers and whatnot. I had planned to be there for another few years. And then, I'd always been thinking about graduate school, like as a vehicle for continuing to develop my writing. I joined the interview program in 2015, and my father got his terminal diagnosis in 2016. And so suddenly being at the job was no longer just about the job itself, but was also about life stability. Malawi at the time only had 2 oncologists for the whole country. They had 1 medical oncologist and 1 surgical oncologist. And so for Dad's advanced cancer, he had colon cancer, they were not able to treat it. It was basically sort of like a, good luck to you. And so, but he had a very good friend, has a very good friend who lives in California, who spends half his year in Malawi and half his year in California, basically the spread of that. He works in the global health faculty at his university. And so basically found him a spot in the cancer center associated with that university's medical system. Okay. And so my parents actually relocated to California in early 2017. So suddenly me making sure to stay at my job in the US was suddenly of utmost importance.
Right.
And even though I had sort of, I'll be honest, like recriminated myself somewhat for maybe not leaving Penn sooner, maybe not jumping into graduate school sooner, suddenly being in the US, like what was the reason that I was able to honestly have some really wonderful quality time for what it was in those last 2 years with Dad, because he was right there in the US. My brother and sister live in Canada. And so we were actually able to spend a lot of time with them. We were reflecting that paradoxically, we spent more time together in those last 2 years than we had done cumulatively in the previous however many years, because we're also spread out all over the world. But it was just a really valuable time, and my job were just wonderful. My boss especially really understood the importance of family time and of you doing enough at the job where you don't feel like you are getting away with murder, but like not pressurizing yourself to do so much that you are taking away from time that you will never get back. My father died. You're not going to be able to get that back if you're like, oh, I got to finish this one last Excel spreadsheet. And there were more than one. It was my boss himself who actually was the one who was like, just go visit your parents. I will me and the team will cover this event. You do not need to be there. And I'd be like, I feel bad for canceling. He'd be like, stop it. Like, just, you'll understand later.
Yeah.
And so I was at, that was 2017, 2018. Dad passed in October 2018. I was in and out of the office for the better part of about 6 months. I took FMLA, I think that's the Family Medical Leave Act, which allows for, either, 3 straight months off or up to 12 weeks off within a 6-month period. And because my time off was unpredictable, I took the 12 weeks, up to 12 weeks over a 6-month period. And so I was basically like in and out of the office, depending on for Dad's final few weeks. And then, again, very grateful for a flexible office because African funerals are very involving.
Right.
And so
I was going to say, you had to travel back and organize. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you see these, a lot of jobs have 3 days bereavement leave, and you're like, for 3 days for
it's like, who has 3 days? Right.
Which African village is it just 3 days? I was like, I'm bringing home clothes for a month of grieving. What are you talking about? And so my boss and office are wonderfully understanding, and, when you talk about real flexibility, he was like, listen, like, if you have days back in Malawi where you just need to check out for a while, like, just like sign into
the system
and sign in and do some work, right? And we'll count that as a work day, and I will approve it, because sometimes he'd been through a death in the family the previous year of his wife's father, and so knew intimately that when you are so highly involved, like sometimes you just need a minute.
Yeah.
And in big complex families, sometimes you need to have a good reason for that minute.
Right.
Like saying, listen,
I gotta work.
I'm going to the next room. I gotta work.
Yeah.
Please do not disturb me from, between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. or whatever it is. For the time difference, I think I was like 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. or something like that. And so I basically up until like the mid-March, I was in and out of the office, because then I went to Malawi, came back, went to California to finish packing up mom and dad's apartment, came back to the US, then had to go back to Malawi again came back to Philadelphia, then had to go back to Malawi again for the will reading and everything to be present for that, because I didn't want it to just be my mother there.
Sure. Yeah.
For complicated cultural reason, like I am his blood and she isn't necessarily. And so my dad's family turned out to be wonderful, but you still sort of have the imprint of the memories of what happened to other friends of yours over the years. And so it was just like, let me just, as long as my boss is okay with this, and he was really genuine. Like, he's like, no, you go handle that. I went back, and it could have been in me and any one of my siblings, but I'm the firstborn, and I did have the most flexibility at the time.
Sure.
My brother was in law school. My sister had just started, I believe she just started a new job. So, it was easier if I went back. So now we're in 2019, and I did what I had the same idea that it feels like most of the world did. It was like, okay, 2020. New decade, we're going to start this job. All right, we're going to start this job. I was like, I had my year of, they recommend that you spend a year, like in the immediate aftermath of a big loss, you don't change anything for a year, right?
Sure.
So I was like, okay, like we're, that gets me through to October 2019. And you know what? Let's just give ourselves the extra grace period, get to December, went home to Malawi, had Christmas with mom and the family, and get back to the US in January 2020, like, right, this is the year, I'm going to change up my life. I think maybe I might, finally take a vacation. Maybe I might think about buying a house. And then March 2020 happened.
Right.
That's what happened with all. And so basically then I ended up, again, the stability of this particular job meant that suddenly changing jobs, watching so many people lose their jobs, made me very fearful about like, let me not quit a job in the middle of this.
Right.
And so basically stayed at that job until pretty much it was right after I got my vaccine in the spring of 2021 that I began thinking about, okay, next. I will be 9 years at Penn now. Let me really get my life moving. And that's actually when I opened up my application for this program.
Okay.
And began thinking about getting together my references and things like that.
Okay.
And then applied that fall, and now I'm here the following fall. Yeah.
Nice. So you kind of answered the why, the where of, how you came to living, working, and playing where you currently
Yeah.
are. But how did you choose that program? And I also want to ask a little bit more about, in that time when you were at Penn, what was your writing doing? You had a job and
Yeah.
you didn't have a full time, but what was your writing doing? And then how that segued into the program that you identified in being where you are now.
Yeah. So my writing actually really, I would say that is something I'm actually really proud of myself for, in that like my writing did largely what I intended for it to do by moving to Philadelphia. I don't think in the way that I imagined it. I think I imagined I didn't think I'd be in Philly for, like a little over, at Penn for 10 years, in Philly for a little over 11. But I started going to summer workshops in the summer of 2013. And my very first workshop piece that I submitted for that first workshop is the Juniper Summer Writing Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And the piece I submitted there is the piece that ended up winning me my first writing prize. And so I like to believe that, and my first writing prize I won about 6 months after that. And I sort of like to believe that the universe gives you signs. And I don't think this is fully my idea. I feel like I read it somewhere where, like, when you're on your path, like, the universe will sort of give you these initial bursts of success.
Absolutely.
To like bring you in to be like, okay, this is right. Because that was fairly, like, for that to happen in rapid succession, right? Submit that essay at Juniper for workshopping, then submit it for that writing prize and to then win it. Won my second writing prize the year after that. And this is where, when I talked about being based at Penn and like the real things that universities can do for you, that particular essay, which I really do reflect on as a really quite a magnificent creative experience. It was supposed to be the term paper, not supposed to be, it was the term paper for a class I was taking on the Song of Songs in translation. And I was interested in learning about, I'd grown up, my parents are Seventh-day Adventists, and I'd grown up pretty heavily in the church, and was interested in questions of literary translation. What are we saying in this language versus the choice to say this thing in this language and in this language, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a 20-page term paper due in December. And I had already talked to my professor about my plan for it. And then it was a very big plan. I basically was going to weave in 3 strands of discussion, talking about the Song of Songs in translation, talking about interweaving it with a narrative strand where I'm talking about a boy I had a crush on or sort of was in love with in school at the same time that I was very religious. And in my young self, having this debate of, love of man versus love of God, and like, am I sinning and everything like that. And so I was interweaving this narrative strand in order to highlight the larger discussions that have happened about the Song of Songs over literally like centuries, which is like, why is this book in the Bible anyway? I mean, it's pretty salacious, it's short but salacious, and what is it talking about, and what does it mean? Like, why do we use the avenue of like clearly human love to be talking about spiritual love? This is a very big project, and I was like, I don't know if I can turn this in on time. And this professor, eternal credit to him, and really like the highest expression of what learning really should be about within academia rather than like deadlines and whatnot. He said, I'm going to give you an incomplete, which means you have until the end of next term to submit this, because I actually want to see you land this. I want to give you the time to do this right. And to my credit, I kept to that. And I spent the next 3 months. I mean, I'd stay at my office late. I was like literally like copy pasting things. I'd print out poetry, and like, cause I interspersed Bible verse with secular poetry and would place them up against each other in this piece to also show that they're kind of doing the same thing. Reaching those like depths of feeling to help humans understand like what it is to have this kind of love. And I spent 3 months. And the paper, of course, was well over 20 pages, probably close to like, I think it was 27, 28 pages. But he was thrilled with it. And of course, my sister would be like, shut up about that. But I got an A. Of course, I got an A. But more importantly, it was like, more importantly, it was such a powerful creative experience because I just felt like I really got at the depths of A, of what I was trying to show, and B, just it felt like I had truly pushed myself to, in that format of an essay, really to the heights of what I could have done with that. And I would not reach that place again for like 6 years, although like I created a lot in that time. Life got busy, and of course then, dad got sick and whatnot. And like, it wasn't really until the pandemic lockdowns when I was at home for long stretches of time where I wrote work that approximated in process and thought what that first piece was. And yeah, and so, but that was like Penn supported, right? Like, I mean, not directly. It's not like Penn was like, oh, good, we're supporting you for that. It was that I was able to take a class and get tuition reimbursement. So take a class for free and be able to go on that intellectual endeavor. And, I did a lot of my work like at my office desks because like I had a 2-screen setup, and that's just easier when you're doing big complex work like that, to be able to swipe it one side to the other. And then I studied German for a couple of years after that. Because interesting, because that's the other half of English, right? I'd done French in school, and I'd done Spanish at that school in Wales, but it was interesting now to study the other half of English by taking German. And I studied that for 2 years. I am way less fluent at it than I should be after that long study, but okay. And I took a class on the Odyssey, the hero's quest, because if you're writing on this side of the world in the West, like the Odyssey is considered like as sort of like the foundational narrative, right? It is, if you want to understand the origins of like this particular type of like narrative storytelling in the West, like written storytelling, whatever, like it's the Odyssey. And I'd never studied it. I never took it in college. it wasn't one of those books that was there in high school. And of course this class wasn't just the Odyssey. Is the Aeneid. It was, then all these other
classics,
Socrates, Plato's Symposium, whatnot. But I sort of wanted to give myself like, okay, if I'm developing this writing career here, this is the jump off point for which a lot of the literary world here understands narrative. So I need to study that. And then actually the very last class I took, and it was for 3 years, I was taking Chichewa, which is my home language in Malawi. It turns out that Penn really tried as best as it can to maintain a very well-developed languages program. And so it means that they take pride in teaching lots of languages from all over, even ones like Chichewa, which relatively speaking, with respect to our population, is not that widely spoken. I took that and started taking that in the fall of 2019. It was almost a year after Dad had died. And basically what had happened was that at Dad's funeral, on the last day of the funeral, there is a meeting called kusesa, and it literally means sweeping. It's the family business one, basically. And at funerals where if it's a young parent, or if it was young parents, etc., and there are young children, that's the meeting where you talk about, okay, who's paying school fees for who, which, uncle, auntie, whatever, might be able to take them in, or might be able to at least send monetary support to support maybe a parent who's still living, et cetera, that sort of thing. There might be some discussion of property if there was property worth there to be discussing, and if it's within, the appropriate confines of the law. Of course, me and my brother and sister were all in our 30s. And so that meeting, kusesa, which is still ritually important, is more generally like, let's set the framework for how we're going to, for our intentions moving forward as a family, with my dad not being there. And, he was the firstborn son, secondborn child, the firstborn son. And so he had been the head of the family in many ways. And so our intentions for how we're going to make sure to maintain family cohesiveness. And so everybody speaks like the various, dads, the chief at dad's village, the chief at mom's village, various uncles of mine and everything like that. Tend to be more men than women speaking. But I wanted to be sure to speak. But I didn't speak very good Chichewa. I grew up in Canada, and my parents, a lot of African immigrants. I noticed this when I went to Penn for undergrad. A lot of African immigrants did not teach their kids the language when they moved over to whichever Western country they were. But, it was sort of like, we're going to leave that behind now.
Right.
My parents, for them, they said, we didn't want to teach it to you because we didn't want your English to be impacted. There weren't, you were already the only Black kids in school. We didn't want you to be further estranged from the experience of the rest of your peers.
Mm-hmm.
But it meant that even though I can hear Chichewa very well, when we moved back to Malawi, I was going to English speaking schools. I was missing Canada terribly, and so I think emotionally I was like, I'm never learning this. When I grow up, I'm going to Canada and the US. I'm never looking back. And so I was very stubborn about that and didn't, because 10 years old is plenty old enough to learn the language, and I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But I joked later, so I did speak at Kusesa, but I had to have one of my cousins translate for me.
Okay. Sure. To make sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because most of the only people, if I was speaking in English, the only people who were going to understand were like my uncles and like some uncles and cousins on my dad's side. I mean, most of them on my dad's side, but everybody else from the rest of the village, no. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people from my mom's village, no. And so to be understood, I asked one of my cousins actually the firstborn son of his late mother, who gave me my middle name, Ali Pao. And so we're very close and everything. He had to speak for me. And I think I came back to the US being like, I'm tired of being the mute cousin at funerals.
Right.
And so when I saw that, Penn had Chichewa classes, and someone had told me about that before, I signed up.
Okay.
And it was actually just me and the professor. Of course, Malawi is so small that the professor actually is the older cousin of one of my friends from school. So I was like, I promise I'm not expecting anything nepotistic. I'm going to work hard. I worked too hard. She was like, oh, you're brilliant. You can dial it back. I was like, yeah, but I want you to know that I'm not taking it for granted. Sure. I'm not doing this Malawian thing of just like, listen, hey, I just show up to class. You give me A's, Penn pays you money, everybody's happy.
Right.
I didn't want to do that.
Right.
So I did that for 3 years. But it actually worked. I mean, my grandma actually has noted that my teacher was much better.
Nice.
And like that she's noted a change in my confidence in speaking with people.
Yeah.
This also means, of course, that I can no longer avoid her lectures.
She'll talk to you and expect you to really listen.
Expect me to really listen and understand and respond.
Right.
Yeah.
All of that.
So, but that's the very last class I took at Penn, and then I finished that class, the third year of that class, in May of 2022, and of course, by
then you're on your way.
On my way.
Yeah. So this is a good segue into my Glocal Speak question. So we want to hear what you hear. So I ask you to share a word, a phrase, or saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience, and why or how you came to value it as a Glocal Speak.
So, having recently moved to the UK, I suppose I would say that the Glocal, I'll give two answers for this. In Philadelphia, and my Philadelphia friends are going to laugh, the word that means the most is John, and it is spelled Jawn, and it means basically, it's almost like it can be, like in that Mad Libs game, there was a person, place, or thing. And so John can be a person, John can be a thing. It's not always a place, like this John, but definitely a thing, like this John, or that John, meaning that person. And so I think I like the varying context in which John can be used. I was in London in June of 2022, and I was with a friend who I had been at university with, and we were walking around in Bloomsbury and down, central London. We turned the corner and we were like, no way. And we saw graffitied onto the wall of this place. It was Jones. I actually put this on my Instagram, and I captioned it. I said, even all the way in London, the streets are calling me home. It was like, I was like, there's some Philadelphian who got drunk and just wrote Jones on this wall. And so I think that's my Philadelphia local speak, which I I did not use regularly, but I was successfully, I think, managed to deploy it to comedic effect from time to time. In the UK, there's a word, I mean, not a word, I mean, it's the word brilliant, but it's the way that British people deploy it that I loved for years, and I think I heard someone use it in a store the other day or in class, and it was like a not quite a light bulb moment coming on, but it was the way they said it. It was like, "Oh, I'm home," which doesn't make any doesn't make any sense, but I suppose for the fact that I've crossed through various intersections over the course of my life, it also felt like it made sense. They said, "Oh, brilliant," whatever it is, and then it was just, "Oh, okay, I recognize where I am now. I recognize it, and I feel recognized." Brilliant is it's not in American English. You wouldn't necessarily. It's an intense word in American English, right? Like if you say something is, "Oh my God, that's brilliant," it's really like, "That's brilliant." And so it's so intense that you wouldn't necessarily use it in day to day. In the UK, it'd be like, "Oh, all right, so we're meeting next week for, at XYZ pub. Oh, brilliant." And maybe it's just the casualness of it or something that into perhaps. But also the genuine enthusiasm wrapped into that intimacy. I don't know. Maybe I'm doing too much. I'm a writer, so. But yeah, local speak. That is something that is, I don't know, I value a lot. It makes me feel like I'm in a place that I recognize. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of my conversation with Michelle Chikaonda. Be sure to come back next week when we learn more about Michelle's travels, and she offers some great travel hacks for your Glocal travels as well. You can catch us Tuesdays with new episodes at glocalcitizenspod.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Amazon, Google, Spotify. You get the idea. Wherever you get your podcasts. Please do like, share, subscribe, tell a friend. It helps people find good content online. And be sure to check out the show notes. They're going to be very rich this week and next. So until next time, bye for now.